Recording in progress.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and we are delighted to welcome you to our Zoom meeting for the second session of the third Jakarta National Conference on Social Science, Humanities, and Research. Sorry for inconvenience. Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and we are delighted to welcome you to our Zoom meeting for the second session of the third Jakarta International Conference on Social Science and Humanities, or we call it JICOSSH. Before we will open the second session, I would like to inform you that we already sent the participants' attendance link on our comment section in chat Zoom and in our WhatsApp group. We hope that all of the participants correctly register their name. Please make sure that you type it correctly. And we are very honored to have with us here this afternoon our keynote speaker, Mr. Erlangga Hartarto, as the Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, Republic of Indonesia, and also our panel speakers, Professor Edward Aspinall from Australian National University, Professor Dr. Muhammad Sazili Shahibi from University Technology Mara, Professor Valerie Muzikant from People's Friendship University of Russia, Professor Chris Alden from London School of Economics and Political Science, and our moderator, Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to listen to the opening speech delivered by Mr. Reza Yamora Siregar on behalf of the Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, Republic of Indonesia. Mr. Reza Yamora Siregar is a special advisor to the Minister of the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. He received his doctoral degree in economics from Brown University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Reza Yamora Siregar.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Again, before I start, let me first thank you for inviting Pak Erlangga to this academic conference. We are very sorry that because of his at the current time, he's basically in Italy for the G20 meeting, and also he'll be spending this week basically in Europe on the issue of G20. He asked me to basically step in and share with you some of the experience that we face when we deal with COVID-19. So let me share some slides. Please allow me to move into the slides. Can you all see the slide now? Can you see it?
Yes, Pak.
Okay, terima kasih. Okay, so I'm going to share some of the experience of Indonesia in dealing with the COVID-19, balancing between health issue and of course national economic recovery. Just a quick summary of the lessons that we learned. We learned basically that this COVID-19 pandemic exposes us to uncharted policy dilemma. Basically, balancing between health management and economic recovery. Right? This is something that we have never done that before. We have seen crisis in Indonesia, obviously, but we have not seen a health crisis or pandemic crisis. and balancing between dealing with the health issue itself and dealing with economic recovery is a new one to us, and it is basically still a work in progress and lessons by doing at the same time. Unlike the previous economic and financial crisis, the impact of pandemic crisis has been severely felt across in very much every sector of the economy, and the severity of that is also quite deep. The sharp slowdown of the economy, be it domestic and global, has never been felt in many decades, in many recent decades. For Indonesia alone, the last time we had this type of economic slowdown was in 1997. And be mindful that in 1997, we have a combination between economic and political crisis. So this is basically completely a new experience as well for us. So given the rarity of the pandemic crisis and the fact that we have limited lessons to learn from, we do had a crisis in the past, a pandemic crisis. 100 years ago, we have some documents on taking stock of what we have learned from the past. But in most cases, given the complete new landscape of the economy that we have right now, whatever we do right now is basically learning at the same time doing adjustment as we address the challenge that we face. So let me share with you some of those challenges. And in the beginning part of this COVID-19, basically in early 2020, and move into what we have at this point and the challenge ahead. If I use one simple analogy and analysis to explain what we face, we can think of situations where we can describe it simple demand and supply situations here. What we find during the crisis of pandemic was immediately when the crisis hit us in early 2020, precisely in the first week of March. By April and May, we did some mobility restrictions. We introduced some semi-lockdowns at the capital city and different part of Indonesia. So what we see is that in the first few months following the outbreak of the crisis in March, we start seeing a lot of contraction in the supply side. Activities, office activities, mall activities, manufacturing activities had to be basically curtailed. Yeah. So the slowdown in the supply side, immediately what we saw also translated in the slowdown of demand side. So when the supply side shift to the left, immediately what we saw is that there's an immediate pickup in loss of jobs. In 1997, we noticed that the informal sector, the small medium enterprises continue to be able to sustain the economy. But this time around, immediately we noticed that those informal sectors have actually experienced the severe slowdown. There were no activities, and that resulted also in weaker demand, because again, when you have no activities, people losing jobs, income drops, and demand also shift back. So supply side drops, and then immediately followed by demand side drops, right? And the demands, the purchasing power drops, resulted back into the supply side, because again, when demand falls, supply also start to fall as well. So there's an interaction between supply and demand, and this vicious circle of economic slowdown, compounded by supply and demand side effects, continues to take place, and that was immediately clear to us in March, April, May, June, basically the second quarter of last year. And that led to basically what we saw, which is basically the first contractions in the economy. We experienced a negative 7% growth in second quarter of last year. And immediately what we had in mind was basically, how do we break this potential vicious circle between supply and demand side? Okay, that was the immediate thinking that we have. How do we break the supply and demand chains And at the same time also, how do we manage the impact of COVID on the health, on the fatality of people, at the same time managing the severity on the economic impacts. So this is again just to show you the quick. So this was the first lessons. There's a supply and demand shock that immediately taking place following the COVID-19. The second shocks we also notice is that if you're not careful in adjusting the mobility of or at least the restrictions of people, we get into the situations where again the wave of COVID strike us immediately. So we have incidents where again we have restrictions. We call it PSBB 1, PSBB 2, but then again when we have episodes where we have a national holiday because of the religious holidays and also Christmas and New Year, immediately every single holiday that we had last year followed by a pickup in COVID incidents in a number of cases. Okay, so we respond again every single time we had that pickup. We respond with another restrictions, right? So between restriction and then we open up again, and there's a holiday sessions that continuously to become the pattern that we notice. So every single time we have a restriction in mobility, we have a fall in COVID case. But as soon as we relax the mobility because of holidays, because of whatever, that
sicker than twist niggers, heads off niggers, fun niggers and gators, chicken wing eating players.
Oh, sorry, sir. I think it's untuk panitia mohon bantuannya. Sorry, sir. You can.
Pak Reza, I'm sorry, Pak. I think you're still on mute. You're still mute, Pak.
can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can
Pak.
you, okay, yeah, okay. So that's the second lesson between mobility and case is critical. So mobility is important for us for economic reason, but again, the cost is basically rising cost of COVID. Now we can also see from a few experience. This is something that we do also at Commandco, where we play around with some analysis. So what we have here, the red scatter line here is basically the case of COVID. So we have a up and down swing on COVID cases. This is basically a percentage growth, and this is the percentage of consumer confidence index. So positive means that there's increased consumer confidence index, and negative means that there is a decline in consumer confidence index. So in the first slide here, we saw that immediately when we see an increase in COVID case, consumer confidence index falls, and vice versa. Okay. Now on the right-hand side, and I'll come back to this. On the right-hand side, what we do, we try to link the impact of consumer confidence index on the private consumptions of the GDP. Because why we are interested on this, private consumption of GDP makes up about 55% of GDP in Indonesia. So private consumption, household consumption is making up about 50 to 55% of GDP of Indonesia. So what we notice is that there's a close correlation, positive correlation between consumer confidence index, especially during the COVID period, with the private consumption. If consumer confidence index picks up, private consumption picks up. That's 55% of the economy. So when we link these two charts, we can conclude basically when we had a case of COVID picks up, consumer confidence index drops. When consumer confidence index drops, private consumption drops. Okay, and vice versa. So case of COVID directly impacted private consumption, and private consumption is 55% of GDP. We also notice every single time that we have case of COVID and we impose mobility restrictions, again, this is from Google Mobility Index. Again, we notice is that there's a positive correlation between mobility index and PMI, Purchasing Manager Index of manufacturing sectors. When there's a high mobility, PMI picks up. When there's a fall in mobility, PMI falls. Okay, so again, every time we do have a high case and we reduce mobility, PMI drops. When PMI drops, from this slide here, it shows that it has an impact directly into gross fixed capital formations of the GDP or investment part of the GDP. So when PMI drops, investment also drops. And investment is about, gross fixed capital formation is about 30% of PDB, of our GDP. Okay, so case of COVID picks up, that will result in private consumption to drop. Private consumption is about 55% of GDP. When we impose mobility because strict mobility because of the case of COVID picks up, that will have an impact in PMI. A drop in mobility will result in drop in PMI, and that will result in investment. Investment is 30% of GDP. So COVID directly costs the economy. And our economy, between private consumption and investment, is about 85%. That's the struggle that we have. In one hand, we want to manage the impact of COVID on health. On the other hand, we know 85% of our economy are very sensitive to our policy in terms of dealing with case of COVID, in terms of case and in terms of mobility restrictions. So that's where we learn during the first year of 2020 when we deal with COVID case. Now, luckily, of course, to some extent, the Indonesian economy is quite resilient and has an ample space. For instance, if you look at from the real sector perspective, the level of our long-term debt, household debt is relatively quite low compared to our neighboring partner countries. From the financial sector system or financial intermediation system, again, the level of return to assets or profitability of bank during up to 2019, early 2020 is still very good. Non-performing loan also quite low. Of course, there's a bit of a concern in terms of the lending growth at that time. In terms of international money, capital mobility, again, our foreign debt is in the borderline. It's about 35% of GDP. But look at foreign quite. I mean, the short-term external debt is quite low, robust, at least in the beginning, quite robust flows. Majority of our debt, our external debt, are very much short, long-term type of debts. Okay. Now, on the public finance, again, we've been very strict with our fiscal policy rule. So we have an annual fiscal policy rule, budget deficit rule of not more than 3% since early 2000. So that helps us in terms of managing our debt. But of course, we have an issue with our current account deficit. So the overall macro space is actually giving us a bit of support. Due to the stringent policy that we have before, we have an ample policy space to deal with this recent COVID. Now, but we are mindful, however, that again, as I said before, this COVID this pandemic crisis has been severe for us. We had been able to basically almost for 10 consecutive years reducing our unemployment rate. Before, by the end of 2019, our unemployment rate was around 5% of the total labor force, but immediately pick up during the first 2 quarters of the year in 2020. Simply again, with the exceptions of agriculture sector, there's been a significant increase in unemployment rate, precisely due to the outbreak of the crisis. We also noticed that there's a pickup, not so much in the NPL, non-performing loans of our banking system, but we noticed there's a pickup in the restructured loans. So the loan that has to be restructured. For instance, for the small, medium enterprises, out of the total loans that the banking system provided to them, only 7% by December 2019 was restructured. But by the end of December 2020, that number became 35%. So there's a significant pickup in the restructured loans, again, part of due to the crisis itself. So you can see the same pattern across corporate loans, commercial loans, household loans, and of course, at the end of the day, out of the total loans, that there's a significant pickup in the restructured loans. So again, labor force is experiencing the pickup in unemployment rate. Banking system, again, I pick up banking system because at the end of the day, the banking system, the banking activity reflected basically what's going on in the economy. So yes, macro space was solid. We have a space, but crisis of pandemic scale created challenge that was severe and immediate following the outbreak in March 2020. Now, because of understanding, so eventually we understood that we cannot do health and economy policy response separately. If we do restrictions for the health issue only, without thinking the economic, you will see the severity of the economic crisis. We saw that in the second quarter when our economy contracted by 7%. So in July, I think around June to July last year, the president basically decided to form a committee in dealing with COVID and economic recovery. We call it PCPAN, Penanggulangan COVID dan Pemulihan Ekonomi Nasional. So just basically we call PCPAN. This PCPAN is directly reporting to the president. It's a policy committee by Pak Erlangga Hartarto, so our minister. And the task force consists of one dealing with the COVID and the other one dealing with economy. So everything is under this policy committee, which is basically headed by Pak Erlangga. So there's a coordination immediately being formed, given the fact that we understood that this cannot be a separate policy measure between the health and the economy. So the health side, for instance, we're dealing with all these provisions of testing, tracing, and treatment for COVID, imposing strict responsibility for wearing masks, washing hands, keeping distance. So this is new behavior, we call it 3M. We're also dealing with supporting our health city, ensuring not only our hospital, but our quarantine system. So if anyone get tested positive, we know that there are some of us, our fellow citizens who has no access to their own capacity to self-quarantine, then we have to basically provide that quarantine facility. And then of course at the end of the day, and I will speak a bit more on this one, is the very important part of COVID vaccine programs. So this is the health aspect, and then on the economic side, immediately in the first semester of last year, we passed what we call Perpu, government putusan, and also 2020. Well, the first thing that we do, we relax the budget deficit rule that used to be 3% budget deficit, 3% of GDP per year. We relax that policy. We allow the budget deficit to be as high as what we need, and immediately we increase a lot of money to support our health and economic recovery agenda. So for that national economic recovery agenda alone, we spent additional 695 trillion. Now, just to give you perspective, on annual basis, in average, 2019 before, if you look at the last 4-5 years before 2019, at most, we are having a deficit of anywhere between 250 to 300 trillion per annum. In last year alone, and it's also this year, just for the national economic recovery agenda, we spent 700 trillion. So in total last year, our deficit was close to 1,000 trillion. So about almost to 6 point something % of the GDP. So that was a significant pickup in terms of budget deficit, because again, we understood we need to spend big. For health, for instance, we spent about 87.5 trillion. This year, we increased that number to close to 120 trillion. Social safety net, again, we focus on health, we focus on social safety net. We focus on ability for the poor to deal with this COVID. We provide money, transfer cash, basic food, facility of health to support the poor. We spent 203 trillion last year. This year we spent over 220 trillion on this one. We provided some business support, especially for the small medium enterprises. So these two areas, in terms of loans, in terms of some policy on the capital for the small medium enterprises. So basically, in essence, this is a new fresh money that was decided. This is, again, I need to stress, this was decided within months, within just a window of a month, or at most slightly over a month. We do not have it by the end of 2019 or early 2020. This policy was kicked in the second semester, so by June we kicked this policy in immediately in response to crisis. So if in essence, if I were to basically summarize what we do, it's almost like we are driving a car and we have the gas pedal and we have the brakes. So we are balanced between the gas and the brakes. We put a brake for the health issue. We make sure that there's no severe impact on the people in terms of the health issues. But at the same time, also we adjust the gas to basically push a bit the economy, so that again the severity of the economic impact of the COVID is going to be managed. So this balancing between pushing the pedal for accelerating economic growth, and at the same time also at any time we need to adjust for the brake should the rise of the COVID-19 case appear, is what we are doing at this stage. So balancing between the brake and pedal is basically a good illustrations or the summary of what we are trying to do between COVID and between health issue and economic recovery. Again, as I said before, budget deficit has picked up around 7%. Now we noticed also when we had that issue last year, we need more money from the economy. We need more financing for budget, but at the same time, there's basically reductions in foreign holdings. So foreign investors actually reducing their holding of our government bonds. In 2019, by end 2019, foreign investors hold about 40% of our government bonds. So every time the government issue government bonds, one of the active investors are non-resident, the foreigners. But as of in 2008 and in crisis period, you notice that there's a complete fall, there's an immediate fall in foreign holding. So basically foreign non-resident selling their government bonds, they're not demanding our government bonds. And the difference between 2008, within the 6-7 months in 2008, we start seeing a recovery of that. But in COVID period, we continue facing a weak demand or relatively weaker demand for our government bonds. by foreign investors. So in fact, at this time, only about 25% of our government bonds roughly are being held by foreigners. So we need more money, but there's less demand from foreign investors. So this is where Bank Indonesia is actually stepping in, and our bank also stepping in. So there's more and more of our government bonds are held by the banking system. By end of 2019, only, but if I'm not mistaken, roughly about 12-13% of the asset of the banking system are in the forms of government bonds. By the end of 2020, the number picked up to around 18-19%. And also Bank Indonesia become a critical holder investor of government bonds, again, to support fiscal policy. We also have a policy center, again, just to give you an example. For instance, for the automotive sector, government provides some tax incentive. Bank Indonesia provides some support in terms of loan to value ratios, so reducing the down payment, for instance, for buying new car, and also OJK relaxing some of the credit standard for the automotive sectors. This provides a bit of incentive for the middle income to purchase automotives. Because one of the things that we noticed is that when we had this COVID, it's very difficult to actually incentivize people to spend. One that has money, middle and upper middle, and the upper class, they're actually putting a lot more deposit into the banking system. So in order to provide incentive for them to spend, we provide incentives to buy new cars and also incentive to engage in investment in property sector. And this is again a combination between fiscal, monetary policy, and supervisory policy, regulatory policy, to provide that activities support. But at the end of the day, the challenge still, and I think this is something that we will see continues to be the challenge next year, and we are anticipating that as part of the commitment of the government, is that the key challenge still remains COVID-19. We noticed that globally, for instance, the case of COVID-19, even though the neighboring countries continues to be quite high, we noticed the pickup in countries like UK, US. So we are still focusing on this because we're focusing a lot in testing and tracing. We're reducing the cost of testing for PCR, for antigen. We make sure that the supply are ample across Indonesia and especially across key ports, airports area. We continuously working in terms of enhancing the capacity for therapeutic. So this is basically enhancing the number of bed availability in hospital. In cases of when COVID picked up, we asked hospital to basically convert more of their beds into COVID wards. Okay, we also deploy a lot more health workers as to support the need for them, and also we do a pickup in vaccinations. Okay, and a number of behavioral change, strict mobility in terms of public places are being imposed, in terms of the usage of office, and so on and so forth are being imposed as well. So again, this is still a focus right now, and we are continuously focusing on this. This is despite the fact that we have seen our case of COVID actually among relatively the best in the world, relatively the good one in the world. Our reproduction rate has been at less than 1 for many weeks now. Less than 1 meaning that one case of COVID does not translate or does not spread, because one case basically stay in that person. If the number is 3, for instance, one case basically resulted in 3 infections. Here we don't see that anymore. And also what we noticed is that the case of death also has fallen quite significantly. In fact, the recent weeks, we have seen the number of cases of death has fallen well below the number that we saw in May last year. So we are actually doing quite well at this point. But again, we are mindful of the situation that there's always a risk that there's going to be another potential wave happening in Indonesia. So one of the things that we do, we basically continuously push for vaccinations. This is on I believe this is on the 17th of October. So I'm sorry, this is not the latest one. It's about a week old. We have given about 170 million doses of vaccines. Yeah. So 107 million Indonesian has been shot at least once. 62 million of Indonesian has been having at least 2 doses of vaccines, so completed the first 2 doses. And we have about 1 million has received the third one. Mostly they're the healthcare worker having the third dose, the first booster. So about 51% of the targeted populations. So we targeted about 200, around 206, 208 million Indonesian out of 270. Why we only target 208? Because we are still looking for the effective vaccine for especially under 12 years old, and also especially for the very old with comorbid issues. So we're only targeting about 206 million, 208 million at this point. 107 of million doses has been injected to those people. So that's about 51% of the targeted, and 30% has completed. Now again, Indonesia has about 270 million people. 206 million doses of vaccine are targeted. 206 million people are targeted. That means it's translated, if one people is about 2 vaccine, we need about over 400 million of vaccines. Now we have ample of that so far. So far at this point, we have roughly about 140 million, if I'm not mistaken, available doses of vaccine that is continuing to be pushed for vaccination around Indonesia. In daily cases right now, we are able to vaccinate over 2 million people. At the peaks, about 2.3 million vaccination is being done on daily basis at this point. Now, on top of that, let me just end my presentation with the following. So again, we have COVID. Unfortunately, we have issue of COVID and this economic crisis that derail basically the reform that Pak Jokowi wants to have for his second term. In the beginning of his second term, he's actually looking for a massive reform in the economy through what we call as omnibus law, or the job creation law, right? Different of Pak Jokowi has conducted about 16 reforms, has announced about 16 to 17 reform, but that reform was basically piecemeal one. So one reform in certain sector, another reform in another sector. But what we do end of last year and continuously doing it this year for completions, we conducted an omnibus law, a comprehensive law, because we noticed that we cannot deal with just one side of reform in one sector. It has to be a complete at the level of national government, at the level of local government, across different ministry, and that has been basically the law has been passed in November last year and being slowly pushed into be implemented. Again, let me stop there. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me pass back the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reza Yamura Siregar, for the keynote speech. And before we will start the main discussion, now we would like to invite our panel speakers. The first one, Professor Edward Aspinall from Australian National University, Professor Dr. Muhammad Sazili Shahibi from University Technology Mara, Professor Valerie Muzikhan from People's Friendship University of Russia, Professor Chris Alden from London School of Economics and Political Science, our moderator, Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum. Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum is a lecturer from UPNVJ Jakarta. She received her doctoral degree from Department of Political and Social Change from Australian National University. In addition, she also obtained her master's degree from Central European University, and also obtained her bachelor degree from Universitas Indonesia. Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum have more than 20 years teaching experience in several universities, such as in UPNVJ Jakarta and Universitas Indonesia. She is active writing scientific papers and other publications. And at the moment, she is the director of Center for Citizenship and Human Rights Studies in UPN Veteran Jakarta. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum.
Thank you, Yvette, for that very generous introduction. Hello and welcome again, everyone. Really glad to host you all today for this second panel we have for the on the Jakarta International Conference on Social Science and Humanities 2021. So this is our third international conference organized by the Fakultas Ilmu Sosial dan Ilmu Politik, or Faculty of Social and Political Science at Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. I'm very happy to be involved in today's panel, as I'm also myself very interested in the topics that we are going to discuss today. And of course, first of all, thank you, Pak Reza Siregar, for the sharing on the updated situation in Indonesia. I'm surely think that our audience here has more to ask and to discuss with you, and I'm hoping that we could have a bit of time to discuss it a bit later, if you would be available. But now I think we start first with our speakers, which I think already here, everyone's here. Then I'll just start with the first speakers. This is a very prominent figure in political science research, especially in Indonesia and Asia. Professor Edward Aspinall, or usually I call him Ed. Professor Aspinall is a professor in the Department of Political and Social Change, the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, Australian National University. He researches politics in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, with interest in democratization, ethnicity, and clientelism, among other topics. He's the author of numerous books, also published about 70 journal articles, and book chapters, most on aspects of Indonesian politics, and is the co-series editor of the Asian Studies Association of Australia Southeast Asia publications book series with National University of Singapore Press, and of the Southeast Asian Politics and Society Elements series published by Cambridge University Press. We're so happy to have Professor Aspinall here, and the title of his presentation will be on the pandemic and politics in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Ed, are you here? Oh yeah, there you are. Hello.
I am here. Hello.
Yes. So I give the room for you now to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first, let me say, firstly, thank you to you as the chair of this session, Dr. Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum, or usually I would know her as Mbak Ayu. So it's a great honor for me to speak at such an event with so many participants I see and so many distinguished guests. It's just a pity that I can't be there in Jakarta in person, but one day we hope that travel will become a lot easier again between our two countries. So let me share my screen. I think I can do that. You can see that all right?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so today I'm going to be discussing the topic that Mbak Ayu mentioned, the pandemic and politics in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And in particular, I'll be sharing some preliminary results of a survey of public opinion we did in 5 countries across the region. Now, when we discuss this issue, the relationship between the pandemic and politics, of course, there are 2 quite different angles we can take. We can look at sort of, in reverse directions of causation. So firstly, there are these questions about how does politics shape the pandemic? What are the effects of politics on how the pandemic went or is going? As we know, there's a huge amount of variation, both among countries, but also within countries about the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic. To what extent is politics a factor that shapes that variation? And the second way we can look at this topic, of course, is to see what's the effect of the pandemic on political life, on political systems, on political structures, helping incumbents, giving rise to new political movements, and as I'll focus a little on this in this discussion, perhaps also having an impact on the balance among authoritarian and democratic regimes in the world. So in this talk, I'm mostly focusing on question number 2. But let me just say a couple of very brief things about the impact of politics on the pandemic. There are different ways we can think about this. In particular, we can think about the impact of politics on the pandemic from above. So what are the effects of regime form, of different types of government on the intensity of the pandemic, for example? So it's still debated whether democratic or authoritarian regimes have been more effective at handling the pandemic. There's quite a lot of literature on this which is beginning to emerge. And the general consensus seems to be that it's quite difficult to make very broad generalizations in this respect. Other factors, government policy, leadership choices, state capacity, in particular the capacity of public health systems, seem to be much more important. And this is a couple of months old now, but you can see that, in fact, well, for example, if we compare different types of regimes, the comparison is often made, for example, between China being an authoritarian regime and the United States being a more democratic country, with the latter being much less effective than China was in handling the pandemic. And there might be something to that, but we can also see that there are many countries which are more authoritarian, which have also experienced big problems and very major outbreaks of the pandemic and very high levels of mortality in particular. We can also look, for example, at the effect of politics from below on the pandemic. So I don't have a slide on this, but for example, there's a lot of data that's coming out of America, or has been coming out of America, on how political identity and partisanship affects things like willingness to wear a mask or willingness to take a vaccine. So areas that voted more strongly for the Republican Party or for President Trump in the 2020 elections have tended to have much higher rates of mortality. But anyway, I mean, that's just sort of background to the discussion today. So that's really about how did politics affect the pandemic, which is not my major focus. I'm more interested in this second question, which is what effect is the pandemic having on global politics? And here the big answer seems to be pretty clear. We know that the world has been experiencing a global democratic recession, sometimes called, or regression, decline for the last 10 to 15 years, depending on how you measure it. According to Freedom House, for example, this global democratic recession has been taking place for about 15 years. What we can see here, well, and we know also, of course, that this pattern of democratic recession is quite distinctive in the contemporary period. Cases like Thailand or Myanmar, where there's a military coup, are actually quite unusual. It's much more common these days to have an elected president or political leader who, once elected, takes measures in order to undermine democratic governance. So that's part of the reason why there's so much interest in populism these days, because we see a lot of elected populist leaders who take anti-democratic policy positions and undermine democratic institutions in various ways. Now, we can see from both of these charts that the big effect of the pandemic year of 2020 was to dramatically increase the number of countries that, at least according to VDEM, which is one of the other big democracy rating agencies, were becoming less democratic rather than more democratic. So the left side shows the number of countries. It shows that 25 countries became less democratic, 16 became more democratic, whereas the right side makes the same calculation, but in terms of world population. And you can see here that the fact that big population countries like India are classified by VDEM as going backwards in terms of their democracy, it has a big effect on that second figure. What are the mechanisms by which the pandemic might be affecting this shift towards less democratic or more authoritarian government worldwide? Well, we can think as well, like we thought about the effects of politics on the pandemic. We can think of this in terms of from above and from below. From above is obvious, I think, right? Because in some ways, a shift from a more democratic to a less democratic government always involves some degree of concentration of power in the hands of the central authorities, the government, or as it's sometimes called in the literature, executive aggrandizement. So a shift in the balance of power from horizontal control institutions within government towards the executive, but also a diminution of the political space and therefore the political influence of groups outside of the government. Now, the pandemic can represent both an excuse and an opportunity for taking action to pursue that process of executive aggrandizement. There's a debate here, of course, about when an emergency measure truly becomes authoritarian. So, for example, there's been a lot of opposition from some parts of the Australian population that various lockdown policies themselves represent a sort of authoritarianism. But I think the general consensus amongst scholars is that so long as emergency measures are reasonably directed towards reducing the level of infection, that they don't spill into other areas, that they can be defendable in terms of democratic theory. Anyway, just worth noting that there's some debate about that. What about, though, from below? One of the distinctive features of the contemporary global democratic recession, as I said before, is that often undemocratic measures are being taken by elected political leaders. So elected president, for example, who then moves to undermine an elected parliament or courts, for example, or reduces the freedom of media. What about in the COVID context? I think it's plausible that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that the population would support authoritarian measures on the part of government. After all, there's a big literature in political psychology that suggests that once people are exposed to a threat, especially if it's like a mortality threat, something that poses a serious danger to their own life, that they tend to adopt more authoritarian political positions. So is it possible that this is happening internationally? So this brings us to the Southeast Asian context. As we know, Southeast Asia has not been immune from this global trend of democratic backsliding or recession. The Philippines under Duterte is a well-known case. I think everyone would know. Thailand had the 2014 coup. We saw the coup in Myanmar, of course. Indonesia has not been as dramatic as these cases, but I think there is a general consensus that the quality of Indonesia's democracy has been in decline over the last 7-8 years or so, depending on how and where you measure it. And we see that reflected in a lot of the public opinion poll information. So Indonesian political attitudes seem to be confirming that view overall, but also sort of the scholarly literature tends to also agree. There's a sort of a new emerging consensus that there is a decline, but not a dramatic, by no means a dramatic collapse or anything like that in Indonesian democracy. And arguably, we've seen an acceleration of this decline over the last 2 years. So the Myanmar coup, I've already mentioned. We saw this confrontation in Thailand between government and opposition. Emergency rule in Malaysia. Philippines, very, very harsh and punitive measures, arguably exceeding what was really needed to control the pandemic. And then Indonesia, we've seen these controversies surrounding the omnibus law and the weakening of the KPK in particular, and then the whole response to the protests that emerged around that time. Again, perhaps not as dramatic as some of the other cases, but nevertheless seen by most observers as marking a new stage in democratic recession in Indonesia. So we were interested, me and a group of colleagues were interested in this topic, and we conducted a survey earlier this year around April, May 2021. So this was before the Delta wave became really terrible in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries. We had about 6,000 respondents across the 5 countries you can see measured here. It's not a fully representative sample because it was an online survey. So we have to bear that in mind, that we have to be a bit cautious at looking at some of these numbers. But we were very interested in how citizens were evaluating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and whether that was changing their political attitudes, and in particular, to what extent they were becoming more supportive, more receptive to non-democratic forms of government. So let's just start with some very general background. This was a question about overall satisfaction with how the government had been handling the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see that in particular, and perhaps not that surprising, the numbers were by far the highest in Singapore. We generally find in public opinion polls in Singapore, generally for many decades now, high levels of satisfaction with government there. You can also see that actually the numbers are quite high in Indonesia, right? So generally speaking, Indonesians in public opinion polls compared to people in many other Southeast Asian countries tend to express pretty high levels of satisfaction with government, and we see that being reflected here as well in terms of the pandemic response. So then we asked people to think about how they themselves were responding to this pandemic. What did they think the political lessons of the pandemic were? I'm sorry, there's a typo in that key down there. And we asked them, do they think whether the pandemic has shown them that their country needs a strong government that puts less emphasis on individual rights, or does it need a government that actually protects individual rights? And we can see quite interesting variation across the cases here. So for example, in Singapore, again, consistent with some of the earlier public opinion polling we've seen in that country, we see fairly strong support for less emphasis on individual rights. But look at the Philippines, for example, quite the reverse result, much, much stronger for a government that protects individual rights. And we've got to remember that this is during the rule of President Duterte, a president who came to power basically promising to violate the rule of law in order to take action against criminals, and has many, many times boasted about his government's ability to kill criminals without going through the due process of law. Indonesia is more balanced, right? You see a slight majority in favor of a government that protects individual rights. So in this measure, Indonesians are relatively, relatively pro-democratic, at least compared to certainly compared to Singapore. This one is a bit more complicated. We wanted to look at what the impact of different sorts of demographic characteristics of respondents would be. So this is the same question, but broken down into basically income groups. So we asked people, thinking about your typical monthly income, do you have enough to save? So in other words, you're reasonably comfortable. You can not only cover your daily expenses, but you can put some aside for savings, enough for living expenses, barely enough to get by, or do you really need help? Quite an interesting set of responses, quite a bit of variation here. In some countries, it shows us that it's definitely the wealthier people, the richer people, who want a stronger government with less emphasis on democratic rights. So this supports the hypothesis about the authoritarian inclined middle classes of Southeast Asia. So for example, Singapore, 65% of the wealthiest people supporting less democratic government, with a much lower number amongst those who are much poorer, who need help. Indonesia, the pattern is not quite so clear. Every income group slightly more in favor of democratic rights. Then we asked a separate question, which was about different sorts of emergency measures that the government might take against COVID if the COVID pandemic got worse. And here we really distinguish between one, which is curfew, so like jam malam, restrictions on people's movements, which really obviously does have potentially has a direct impact on restricting the circulation of the virus, versus these other measures which are less directly associated with virus control. So censoring the media, getting the military involved in government, suspending civil liberties, and passing emergency laws without the approval of Parliament. You can see here that, so this is the response across all 5 countries, and you can see here that there's quite a bit of variation actually, that once you start digging into the details like this, you can see that Southeast Asians are not giving blanket 100% support for authoritarian measures in the face of the pandemic. While several of these you can see are quite evenly split, there's strong support for curfews and, generally speaking, quite strong opposition to censoring the media in particular. Here's the breakdown for for these individual countries. For these questions, you can see the key by the colors at the top. Interestingly, Indonesia has majority support for most of those measures, with the single exception of censoring the media. But generally speaking, you can see that when we get to the specifics, Indonesian respondents tended to be generally more supportive of their government taking hard actions against the pandemic, potentially illiberal actions than in many of the countries of Southeast Asia. What is really dramatic here and interesting is the gray bar you can see with 69 on it for Indonesia, showing that Indonesians amongst residents of all of these countries of Southeast Asia have by far the highest support for involvement of the military in politics. So compare that to Thailand, for example, which has had recent experience of a military rule where there's quite strong opposition to military involvement in politics. In Indonesia, it's almost double the level of support. So the legacy of Dwi Fungsi ABRI, I think, is still quite strong in the Indonesian Republic. When we add up the support for the various measures, we can see that Indonesia, in fact, is by far the most, respondents in Indonesia were by far the most supportive. So I'd be interested in getting feedback from participants today about why you might think this is the case. You can see even greater support in Indonesia than in these traditionally more authoritarian countries like Singapore. A good part of the explanation is the different figures on the military, I think, but that's not the whole explanation. Notable here too that across Southeast Asia, it's only really Thailand where we see overall quite strong opposition to these measures in total. We started to do some regression analysis of the results, and interestingly, one of the clear findings we have, and this sort of supports some of that political psychology literature I mentioned before, that contact with threat, so perceptions of threat, can have a big impact on support for authoritarianism. That it's especially respondents who said that they had a friend or a family member who died of COVID who had the strongest support that had a really large effect on increasing support for authoritarian measures, almost as large as the effect of being a supporter of the government in the country involved. So I guess that's it, just to share these, as I said, very preliminary findings of this research. It seems that the Southeast Asian democratic recession is accelerating as a result of COVID. We have to be cautious about assessing how long this process will last. Will the situation change again once the COVID pandemic is under control? The key mechanism is from above, i.e. that mechanism of executive aggrandizement. As I said, I mean, that's the standard model for democratic recession in the contemporary world. But there are sort of mixed results on support from autocratization from below. Southeast Asian publics are not giving blanket 100% support for democratic recession in response to COVID. Quite selective, in fact, supporting some measures, opposing others, and being quite split on a lot of these responses. Quite a bit of variation across countries, stronger support for backsliding in Indonesia, strongest opposition in Thailand, which again, we'll recall amongst the countries we've looked at is the one with the most recent experience of military rule. And it's those who have experienced the most severe impact of COVID, i.e. individuals who've experienced a loss, someone has died, a friend or family member has died, who are most supportive of more authoritarian measures, which suggests that it's possible that this will be a temporary phenomenon, that once the COVID pandemic passes its peak, once that threat perception, that sense of danger to mortality recedes, that many individuals will go back to their former earlier political positions. So there's plenty of room here, I think, for additional research to be done in this area for participants in this conference who work on these sorts of issues to do with political trends and with political attitudes in particular. There's a lot more we need to do about causation, so what lies behind these sorts of attitudinal shifts. To what extent is this really all about pandemic severity? As I said before, will things change once the pandemic fades? To what extent are demographic and other political factors involved? And is it possible that the pandemic is simply accelerating disillusionment with existing government, whether authoritarian or democratic, or perhaps even strengthening our support for existing government in what's sometimes called the rally around the flag phenomenon? So thank you very much for patiently listening. I'm sorry if I've gone over time, but that is, as I say, some rather preliminary findings from this research that we've been doing here at the Australian National University and across the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for that. I think that's really interesting. This is a survey from 5 countries, yes, mostly quantitative, and yeah, and even the results or the findings from that surveys, I think it's very interesting to portray how pandemic and politics interlink during these times. And I think it's not only how the pandemic implicates to the politics, but also in some ways politics, how the politics itself then uh, determining how the government or the state is handling the situation in during the pandemic. So I think this aspect is really important, and that is, I think, missing from Pak Reza's presentation in the case of Indonesia. And you've talked a lot about the data on the Indonesia side, and it's really surprising for me that the numbers from that survey for the support for authoritarian measure is the highest one in the 5 countries that you studied. I also would like to know more from the discussions. I'm open for participants to post questions or comments, but please do that in the chat room. And then for the time being, we will go back there and discuss it. But for the time being now, we move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Professor Dr. Muhammad Sazili Shahibi, who is currently the Vice Chancellor on Student Affairs at University Teknologi Mara, Malaysia. He is also board advisory member of the Malaysia National Archive and was the board of director of Malacca State Public Library Corporations in 2017, and also Director Institut Pemikiran dan Kepemimpinan Melayu UITM, and then was the Dean Faculty of Information Management at UITM from 2015 to 2017. Professor Sazili Shahibi's expertise has been built around communication and content management. Today's topic for his talks will be on the challenges in creating mobile commerce content. Professor Shahibi, are you here? Yes. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Nice to meet you. All right, I'll give you the room for your presentation. Thanks.
Okay. Can you view my slide?
Yeah.
Can you view
great.
my slide? Okay.
Yes.
Assalamualaikum and very good evening to everyone.
Waalaikumsalam.
First of all, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation to the organizer for inviting me today. It's given me a great pleasure to share my opinions in this conference webinar. So due to the COVID-19, we are here online, and despite the hurdles of physical interaction and SOP. Today I will share my opinion about challenges in creating trusted digital content for mobile commerce. Yeah. So the advancement of wireless information communication technologies providing positive impacts to the development of digital content. It is moving forward actively to fulfill the information demands for society regardless time and place anymore. Yeah. Then the creations and modification of digital content have become a lucrative new professions and essential for digital economy development. However, the promise of widespread exposures and popularity amongst online users, yeah, heighten the likelihood of chaos due to the miscellaneous and security breach. In addition to everyday operational activities have come increasingly online, with 2/3 of the world population now being online. As a result, the risk of exposing personal data and digital thief is also increased. The advancement of information technology have enabled content consisting of all type of information residing in central repository and can be accessed by anyone, anytime, and anywhere. It enables an easy way for collaboration by creating dynamic web page. It also allows for quick and easy updates and provides useful plugins and tools to make your site as effective and secure as possible while also having and saving you time and money. So the most recent issue is about digital content is how to humanize online activities to support large populations, communication control, and community support for continuous life. The growing concern about netizen is an internet known this day is that technology will become the master of the teachers. I speak from the standpoint of normalizing technology and digital literacy when everyone can access the latest application to adapt with futuristic smartphones. We cannot ignore the minorities who disagree from a broader perspective. Managing such a diverse range of digital content and data amidst opportunities and blind suffer presents some not so hidden opportunities. So we can say that technological advancement have made easier job. The strategic approach to manage digital content process and stage of knowledge retrieval by scaffolding unconfirmed. Yeah. So this is the outline of my presentation. Okay. Just now I give my preface of my presentation. So so in December 2019, okay, November 2019, coronavirus disease was first detected. Yeah. So during the pandemic 19, you can see that society depends on digital content for the survivals. Yeah. So everyone who may wake up in the mornings will find their mobile phone to access digital content for information to make themselves keep update about their surroundings. COVID-19 is a deadly virus easily spread through touch or direct contact with positive COVID-19 patients. Prevention action were taken to stop the chain of COVID-19 such as social distancing, work from home, stay at home, and encouraging online shopping instead of face-to-face. Initially, people never expected the need to stay in pandemic with practicing prevention action for a long time of pandemic period, and currently it was happening almost 2 years. The pandemic provides huge impact to the societies and economic growth. It has negatively impact to the society and economic development as well. Stay-at-home order during pandemic COVID-19 makes people highly rely on mobile communication for medium interaction due to the conveniences. It decreased their inclination to shop in store and decreased reliances on their mobile phones. Before COVID-19, mobile phone was utilizing for fulfill their information needs by social discussions. In preparing digital content, strategically, you would not forget to examine the issues that need to overcome. Yeah. So people need to stay at home to stop infection, to stop virus infections. Okay. So something that we can deny that COVID-19 have provided negative economic impact to the many countries, and I can say that every country in the world facing with the problem of economics due to the COVID-19. Okay, and then some countries and depressed global annual growth this year to the 2.5%. Okay, so many countries having with the problem with the economic growth. Okay, however, COVID-19 has accelerated the use of mobile commerce. Yeah, the use of mobile commerce, because that is the conveniences people to shop online to gain what they want in their life. Okay, stay at home during COVID-19 makes people rely highly on mobile communications for medium interaction due to conveniences. On the bright side, these new norms lead to the growth of mobile commerce. Yeah. So this is the term of the mobile commerce. So mobile commerce can be described as any monetary value transactions, both direct and indirect, occurred across a wireless telecommunication system. Mobile commerce may carry out at any time, at any place across the globes. Okay. So the most important is about the element of the mobile commerce provide people with the interaction that they can have a transaction, business transaction, regardless time and place. Okay, so you can see here, okay, in the normal circumstances, the adoption of the technology is quite slow because it depends on the digital culture society. However, during the COVID-19, we can see that the level of adoption of society for the mobile is quite great. Okay, it's quite great, which is you can see here from these figures. Okay, from these figures demonstrated that Indonesian, okay, is quite high in terms of adoption of electronic commerce. And then maybe indirectly something is related to the total of the population of the Indonesia is quite big compared to the others Southeast Asia. But this is the very positive sign that the mobile commerce, the digital cultures accelerated. Okay, in a good sense from the perspective of using technology or ICT for the economic developments. Yeah, so I can see that the potential as well. Okay, the potential is quite good. Okay, which is nowadays maybe also relate with the Industrial Revolution 5.4.0 or 4.0. Okay, the world's moving toward the mobile commerce or wireless transactions. So you can see here that it was reported that maybe 6.6 trillions of value of the mobile commerce will increase. Okay, I would like to speak from the perspective of content or digital content. Okay, in order to make the mobile commerce develops. Okay, this is because the digital content is about content. It's about content to inform people. Okay, to inform people and to provide people with the information. Okay, provide people with information for assist people to make a decision, for assist people to solve their problems. Okay. And then nowadays, content is king. Content is king because content will make sure. Okay, will make sure what is the perception of the peoples, and then the level of the successful of the societies and the level of the successful of the organization, especially for the commercial organization, is depends. It depends things on the digital content from their websites. Okay. So mobile commerce activity is subjected to the significance of the digital contents, because it is the leading factors toward the usage of mobile commerce. Okay, is the website content itself. Mobile commerce website content allow user to find their needs by click away at any time and any place. The role of the content is to create trust in the mobile commerce. So how do we create mobile commerce digital content in order to gain people trust and then to make themselves participate in mobile commerce. Okay, so trust in the content is about how they feel positive. Okay, they feel secure, feeling or belief on an individual on a specific environment. So it's something that positive, important roles in an uncertain situation. And then mobile commerce require more level of a user trust than traditional channel, because the interaction is less faceless. Okay, so that means the content play an important role. Okay, to make sure that the engagement online will be happens. So this is what, in my opinion, okay, this is the trust challenges in mobile content. Okay, the first one is about information overloads, and then reliability of the digital content, credibility of the digital content, service quality to the digital content, culture related to the digital content, objectivity of the content, and then a security of the content as well. I go one by one. The first one is about information overload. Okay, information overload is about how the information available exceeded, okay, the needs. With the advancement of the information communication technology, sometimes the information situation or people situation is quite saturated. Okay, it's quite saturated. Okay, in recent times, the world has witnessed a dramatic increase the amount of formal and informal information produced in the crowded information societies, in which the amount of information being created every 2 days is equivalent to the created from the dawn of civilization until 2003. This means that one of the fastest growing quantities in this planet is the amount of being produced, and information overload is recognized as a potential big problem in modern society. Twitter, for example, reported that average 200 million tweets were posted during June 2010. Okay, and there are a varied body of research into information overload across many differences. Okay, information overload. People receive so many information that will make them confused. Okay, and will make them fear, and then information overload as well will create depress among the users. Okay, and then the second one is about reliability. Okay? Reliability of the content. It's important to make sure the trust of the digital content for mobile commerce. Okay, so reliability is about how do people feel it is something expected for them when they access information, and then they will feel that the information will be relevant for the long term, and then dependability, quality over time, and then the availability of the information when it's needed. Okay, and then the credibilities of the information or in order to creating the trusted digital content, about accuracy, currencies, and authorities of the information to establish the trusted digital content. And then Another factors is about mobile commerce content are negatively navigatability, content quality, interactivity, and users enjoyment. Okay, and then the service of the quality information would able to serve. I mean, the content can serve, can provide the quality to the users. And then the digital content as well relate to the culture, to the information culture. Suit with the people value. What is the value of the people? It is also reflect to the what the information, okay, display to the peoples, okay, and then to make sure that the digital content as well is aligned with the people believe and value they hold in their life. Okay, because when we talk about in from the universal levels, okay, the culture about digital information or digital content as well different or varies among countries to another countries. And then the objectivities, like to make sure that the content provide the objectivity perspective. Okay, that mean they know, they understand what is the objective of the digital content, the message they're trying to convey by the digital content is quite important to make people not confusing. Yeah. Okay, and then the securities. Okay, the securities. Okay, uh, the securities factors. Okay, to make sure that the digital content is secure, free from the threat or dangers. Security content principles are confidentiality, availability, privacy, and the integrity of the information. Okay, to make the digital content is trusted. Okay, for the conclusions, okay, I would say that mobile commerce is expected for the future economic environment. It is proven to provide conveniences and assist people during pandemics or fulfills needs and created revenue or incomes. Overcome a challenge in mobile commerce content will create a stable economic environment and provide benefit to merchandise and consumers for world's prosperity in the future. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shahibi. That was really useful information to you share. And I think I get the impression that our talks is, like jumping around here and there, but actually we're not, because as we can see, pandemic is a global situation that we experience, every one of us, in any other parts of the world, and we can see how that changes aspects of our lives, including the daily practices of our lives, like the increased use of mobile commerce is one that I think Professor Shahibi was rightly mentioned, and we can also tell from our observation, daily observation, how people are now changing their mode of shopping or transactions from the conventional one to the more mobile one. So and it's not without risk and challenge, as Professor Shahibi mentioned. And I think you are very correct, Professor Shahibi. We need to also note those kind of challenges that we could face, and try to identify ways to also deal with it. So I also look forward for comments and thoughts from the audience on what Professor Shahibi was presenting to us, and because this is this is something that I think everyone is observing nowadays during the pandemic, and this is also relates to our next presentation on how the COVID pandemic also increase the utilization of new media, which will be presented by Professor Valerie Muzikant. I'm sorry, I hope I say it correctly, Professor.
Yes, sure, yes.
Professor Valerie is full professor of the Mass Communication Department in Philological Faculty since 2000, head coordinator of International Communication Association in RUGN University, a 5 times winner, wow, of National Book Contest in Advertising, Public Relations, and Strategic Communications. The main areas of research are media economics, international branding, mass media, sociology and integrated communications, as well as new media development in the communication society. Professor Muzikant is a head of research project supported by the Russian Foundation for Basic Research, as well as International Foundation, um, yeah, Erasmus. Yeah, I think perhaps you can explain more about the research that you are involved in. And as I mentioned earlier, Professor Muzikant will be sharing us about the new media utilization during COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, so Professor, the room is yours.
Thanks, ma'am. So I will make some comments to our recent monograph which was published by Springer. So let me start my presentation. My name is Valery Lusta. As you mentioned, I'm professor of people French at the University of Russia, and our team just completed this research. So let me just mention what we found. Media on the internet and communication technologies changed human life in the 21st century for sure. We can say that the internet is one of humanity's greatest inventions. Everyone can connect with the internet. Various things can be done remotely. Various meetings via teleconference of hours can be implemented through remote without limited space and time. In addition, the development of the internet and communication technology.
I'm sorry, Professor.
Yes, ma'am.
I think
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know whether it's only me, but your volume is so small. Can you perhaps?
Sure. Let me just. Sorry, ma'am. Yes, let me just.
Yeah, I could hardly hear what you're saying.
To do a correct, no?
Yeah, a bit better.
What shall I do? Is it a little bit better? No, not good.
Yeah, I think we can continue. I think this one is better than the previous one. No, terima kasih, Pak.
Right? Okay. Sorry,
Yeah, terima kasih.
New media has an interactive and free nature. Interactive means direct interaction between the communicant and the audience through media they consume. In our monograph, we include works given with integrated design and solution. You can read here on the slide. So our research was done by a scholars in many countries, actually all over the world, and recently this book was published, and we just paid attention to digital media, which related to use of data from one device to another. The presence of digital media can facilitate humans in their work. Although in other parts, it can also be understood that new media are networking. The internet can have positive and negative impact on its use. So we concentrated on this topic as well. But first of all, I would tell you that our book was separated in 6 parts. First part introduces us to communication, messaging, goals, and examination of the 1918 influenza and SARS pandemic. The second part, we just show different health communication theories. In part 3, it was about phenomena in pandemics, that affects resiliency and involves messaging during COVID-19. Besides it, in part number 4, we just analyzed rhetoric of Mr. Trump at the beginning of fake news, I would say, I would dare say. And in part 4, just analyzed how the pandemic and resilience period is going in Spain, South Africa, and Netherlands, and of course we touched upon situations in Indonesia as well. So in the last part, we just completed our research with Ebola in Liberia and so on. And I still believe that although fake news itself has been practiced for a long time, it has earned its place in the digital world. Research of the New York Times database from July 1, 2016 to December 31, 2016 totals up 319 articles in which the phrase fake news appears, maybe 30, I would say. And Mr. Trump tweeted 5.7 times per day, and then during the second half of 2020, it increased more than 6 times. The frequency justifies that Trump has indeed used Twitter as political tool. And in our research, we also mentioned that if you look at this diagram, you will see the content of Donald Trump fake news. And I also one more example. It's about Russian president. This fake news was released at the very beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. President Putin released 800 tigers and lions to force residents to stay home. That's such a funny information. Some researchers labeled Trump as the biggest liar in the history of the U.S. presidency, for repeatedly telling big lies despite the fact and empirical evidence. In our research, we consider fake news as one of the most influential tools to manipulate the public opinion with false information in the so-called post-truth era. Thus, journalists have occupied an influential position in society, namely those who can strengthen and provide legitimacy for what they preach. The research survey of Americans shows that nearly 65% of the population felt fake news confused them about facts. The first to call for a focus on relationships in public relations scholarship was Mary Ellis Ferguson, my colleague and researcher, and Mr. Grunig, yes, Mr. James Grunig, of course. That is why I wanted to mention some more facts that with climate, the Trump attacks on the Capitol Hill building on Wednesday, January 6, 2021 night, was due to be consumed by Trump's disinformation, claiming that baseless election fraud was shared on social media platforms. Fake news can have a negative impact on increasing racial issues such as Islamophobia, xenophobia, and others. So in our book, we wanted to use, and we used actually, they are models for detecting the truth, I would say. Actually, to measure public's perception of an organization, Grunig proposed the following index. Of course, you're familiar with all of them, so I wouldn't just read all of them. I just mentioned trust, control, neutrality, commitment, satisfaction, communal relationship, exchange relationship. And you know, trust is become crucial in public health. And all our content analysis shows that the trust problem online about both in and out of the public health field can be completely eliminated by modern public relations understanding. That is why we try to show that infodemics is a real threat to society. Moreover, people are one of digital network. When individuals search for sources of information via Google, they provide their data for analysis by Google algorithm. So with this kind of habit, the algorithm can predict people's preferences according to the data they have been obtained. Google is a huge source of those data. We just provided different examples of disinformation, examples of misinformation, malinformation, different kind of satire and parody, as well as false connection, misleading contact, false contact, imposter content, manipulated content, fabricated content as well. If you look if you look at the road cloud by New York governor Andrew Cuomo, you could see the main phrases which were used during pandemics in this slide. It's very, I would say, positive kind of appeals, and you can see because he more or less succeeded, in beating this danger. And in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, we found out that 63% population say that social media has feel less lonely during the outbreak. You see, it's also interesting fact, and our research is part of Indonesia. So important because 74% of Indonesian population can use internet this year up to 1.9% of the previous year, and because of this, we just succeeded in finding some interesting facts in the very beginning of pandemics in Indonesia. There were only 11 fake news stories in January, based on our research. Only 11 fake news. Later on, from April to June, cases continued to increase. In April, the number of cases reached, 8,509. So they were nearly doubled. As fake news about COVID-19 becomes the subject of public discussion, the newsmakers began to produce false information that would upset the public. It happened not only in Indonesia, all over the world, but we concentrated our focus on Indonesia, and media platforms for spreading fake news, looking like this, mostly Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter. I've just repeated that it was the very beginning of pandemics. And if you look at the types of fake news in Indonesia, also news fabricated mostly, they are photo manipulation, ignorant information, as well as advertising and PR and propaganda. Of course, I have to mention a number of issues regarding COVID-19 folks follows exactly about COVID-19, then policy, then media. You can read it here on our diagram. So the main idea, which just I want to sum up with text presented in the media, attempt to influence or generate attempt to force them to change the belief to make certain action. All the focus about COVID-19 have decreased due to various factors. We can figure out in how social media becomes the dominant platform for obtaining information. About online platforms, particularly social media, are becoming the main news source for a growing number of individuals, and information seems to have found new channels. That's true. Besides, we consider infodemic resilience and the ability for systems to recover from drastic change. Yes, fake news is always a complicated problem for many countries, in Indonesia, in my country, in the United States, and the government may be appropriate to centralize all the information in the central government's hands, I would say, as well as many communities taking part in educating and verifying information, participating with public understanding. In our research, Indonesia was classified as very late in responding government officials are not effective policies resulting in consuming information about the policy itself. So later on, the government, the Indonesian people responded quickly by making various verification efforts so that the information get more accurate. It's almost about everything. In my report, you see, I'm a little bit confined because of sprinkler license. That is why I try to make it brief and more or less understandable. Thanks for your attention. Therefore, that's it.
Thank you, Pak Valery, for that great presentation. I think this is also something that we can observe since COVID-19 pandemic took place in these countries, especially in Indonesia. You know, the significant increased numbers of fake news and hoaxes, and what you call the manufacturing news. I think what your study is confirmed what we are experiencing today. And this is also
one more thing, yes, if you don't
yes,
mind.
sure.
I want to express my gratitude to my colleagues from Indonesia. You know, it's Muhammad Muksid, you know, PIR, this guy, yes, and requested for Thomas, yes, also from Western Jakarta University. So thank you so much. It was our team, and so you know, I want to give
Okay.
gratitude.
And
Thanks, many thanks.
okay. All right. Well, congratulations for that research. I think that's a very good research, and in particular, these slides. It really interests me because you see the second point here, communism. Usually in Indonesia, you know, these issues, fake news and hoaxes, always built around these issues. But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, during the pandemic, it's very much decreasing, and we can see the COVID-19 becomes the dominant fake news during this 2 years of pandemic. So again, thank you and congratulate for the research, Pak Valerie.
I hope.
Right,
I
so
hope, I hope
audience,
that one day
ladies and yeah.
Indonesia. I hope one day we'll see Indonesia speak, not via online, but offline. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, if you have comments or thoughts, please write it in the chat room, and then we'll come back to that. Some questions already raised there in private message, and I will read it a bit later after we continue with our fourth presenters, Professor Chris Alden from LSE. Professor Alden teaches international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science and is director of LSE Ideas. He is a research associate with South African Institute of International Affairs and author and co-author of numerous books, including the most recent one is New Directions in Africa-China Studies, published by Routledge in 2019, as well as having written numerous articles in internationally recognized journals. The topics for Professor Alden today is from global solidarity to global pandemics, Indonesia and Africa through a foreign policy analysis lens. So we're going global now, discussing about solidarity, and we can see the how Indonesia and Africa through the foreign policy analysis have been doing this. So Professor Alden, the room is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, just to start with those sort of issues?
Yes,
can you hear
clear
me
and loud. Yes.
Great. So I will now share my screen. And again, if that's, could you confirm that you can see all of that?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, super. So let me start with thanking you for this very kind invitation. It's a real honor to be part of this episode. I hope that this event, and I hope that in doing so that my, as you said, a more global perspective will in fact complement and reflect some of the discussions we have had in the last couple of hours. Let me start by saying something about the key points that I want to make. One of them is that Indonesia and Africa have a strong foundation, that it's rooted in history, that there's an economic logic there. That logic is aligned to Indonesia is an active emerging power, an exporter of investment capital and the like at this stage, complemented by an Africa that is investment hungry. It needs the resources. It's been developing itself in recent years, and 5-6% growth until the recent COVID episode. So there's and of course the future in demographic terms is clearly in Africa is going to grow that market. So we have great opportunities in that regard. There's a diplomatic logic of Afro-Asian solidarity. And Indonesia, in a sense, is the sort of point of departure for that historically, and that multilateralism, that diplomatic logic will be fitted into, has already been fitted into, and can grow in a variety of fora, be it the United Nations, the agencies, regional organizations like IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and others. Second point, the takeaway is that the pandemic, it stalled what was a growing relationship. Pretty much from 2014 onward, we've seen this effort to grow this relationship, culminating in the Indonesia-Africa Forum 2018. And I would argue that the stalling has kind of provides an opportunity for accelerating this process in certain ways. So I think that this is an opportunity which Indonesia and Africa can take part in. And I think that the focus, from what I can see, would be around the blue or maritime economy. That this builds on Africa's emerging position as a market and as an industrializing in the beginning stages of industrialization, and that the African continental free trade area is the policy instrument rather for that. So those are my key points. I wanted to put those in the front, and then let's talk our way through the argument. First, a little bit about, so today I'm going to talk about foreign policy analysis very briefly, what it can tell us about Indonesia-Africa ties. I'll look at foundational content, the Indonesia-Africa relationship in the past, the contemporary context, Indonesia and Africa today, and then post-pandemic, Indonesian and African futures. So sort of tying all of those things together. Let's see. Oops. Okay. Yes, in looking at this, let me minimize this part here. My focus on the relations will say that that I know it's not much in the political currency today, but the global maritime fulcrum still has a kind of framing of the relationship and the rationale for engagement across the Indian Ocean with African partners. And so I think that we keep that as I said, I know it doesn't have the currency it did 5-6 years ago, but it nonetheless, I think, still is a meaningful concept. And it leads us to talking about foundational content, the deep history, if you like. 10th century ocean links between migrants from Indonesian archipelago and to Madagascar and the eastern African littoral, the coast. This is very, it's left, that migration has left cultural markers, social markers in terms of practice, language, and the like. Now this is of ancient origin, and yet I think it still is a reference point for both societies in Africa, different societies in Africa, and those regions in particular for Indonesia. Dutch colonialism and the Cape Colony in Southern Africa, today South Africa, in the 17th and 18th centuries, also is another expression of, again, that cross-Indian Ocean interaction, which gives a logic, a history and a logic to our contemporary engagement. Here again, migrants, the population within the Cape Province called Cape Malays are in fact from the Indonesian region principally. Even the language of Afrikaans has many strong derivatives linguistically from local language in Bahasa and the like. Islam enters in from the south. We often talk about Islam in North Africa, but it enters in from the south at this point and shapes communities, ideas, etc., even to the point where through the colonial, anti-colonial resistance leaders from Indonesia were and their followers were incarcerated and left to thrive ultimately in Cape Town. So if that's the deep history, then the more contemporary one is rooted in independence and decolonization. Of course, Bandung is the touchstone for Afro-Asian solidarity, and that what we see growing out of that is a kind of sustained cooperation between the African group and the Asian groups in the United Nations and other multilateral settings. Quite obviously, the non-aligned movement flows from that sort of initiative. South-South technical cooperation takes hold. So this habit of, however small at that particular era, of exchanging technical views, of collaborating on in multilateral settings begins. The last phase, and this speaks specifically to some of the issues in South Africa, are Indonesia-South Africa relations post-1994, democratic elections. There became diplomatic, economic, and cultural domains here. We saw the beginning of Indonesian trade and investment into South Africa and counterparts the other way. Diplomatic cooperation, a somewhat controversial view of Nelson Mandela and the Timor-Leste conflict, but one that ultimately gave rise to the conditions we see today. The bilateral ties between African states across the board, going beyond just these sort of historical cultural roots occurs. We see the opening of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which offers up an opportunity for, it's a very, very widely based organization with broad cooperative goals for the region, but it becomes a framework within which discussions can happen and where participants across the coastal regions of the Indian Ocean can come together and set out their particular views on the region as an economic, environmental, geopolitical even, or strategic region. And then again, this was reinforced and revived, this new activist Indonesia with a new Asian-African strategic partnership launched in 2005. So let's pull this, having sprinted, I should say, through history. let's talk about the contemporary context. The contemporary context of Indonesia's policies towards Africa are rooted in the recognition that Indonesia is, as a democratic, economic, emerging power, one set to be, by some predictions, to be the fourth largest economy by 2050, that it needs to look outside and beyond the Asian, Southeast Asian and traditional partners in the West to position itself on the globe, and one of those areas where it really needs to go beyond that, and that was recognized by the Indonesian president in 2014, was to expand activities in Africa, both as a market, right, an opportunity, resource supplies, there's complementarities between Indonesian manufacturing, value-added activities. The digital economy as well is a key component or proponent of expansion, particularly with the youth. And that all of these things combined meant that expanding Indonesia's position within the continent would be crucial. Indonesian-African trade in 2017 reflected that. The growth in trade had grown over 16% over the previous year. We see $4.86 billion worth of exports, 3.97 billion of imports. Indonesia has a trade, largely, in broad terms, a trade surplus. So it's a good thing from the Indonesian perspective, yet another rationale for reaching out there. And again, this is all done in the context of that grand strategy framework of Indonesia as centered in a fulcrum, moving across the Pacific on the one hand and expanding its relationship eastward, westward rather, towards the African entities. The economic logic and the multilateralist logic comes together in the form of the Indonesia-Africa Forum of 2018. This becomes a site for leaders, ministers to come together from the different countries to define the relationship. Well over 40 senior African leaders and countries are involved. 55 countries in Africa, so you can see the majority take this very seriously. It's very important. It's a place where targets were set. Where shall we grow this relationship? Informal discussions are held to mediate the particulars of the relationship, in terms of trade, in terms of perhaps diplomatic concerns. It's a place where even negotiations could eventually take place. So as is often the case with big summative sort of events like this, we see a lot of news about trade deals or the value of trade that could be expanded and possible investments and the like. So different estimates emerge after the conference, and one of them being well over $1 billion worth of new deals to be signed off on. So that's very good. It also builds on bilateral. It becomes an opportunity for engaging with bilaterally with African actors on the part of Indonesia. So with Nigeria, the largest trading partner at the time, and Angola, big provider of oil. Of course, South Africa, I've already mentioned, Egypt, Ghana, Tanzania. All these are key players in the growing economic relationship and diplomatic, and building on diplomatic ties as well. Ethiopia is important, though the economic presence is minimal, but recognizing that Ethiopia as the headquarters, as hosting the headquarters of the African Union, becomes a kind of crucial piece of all of the efforts to engage with the African Union as a whole, right? So positioning there is very crucial. One of the vehicles used in managing bilateral relations was the Joint Commission on Bilateral Cooperation. These joint commissions become points where counterparts in each side on the two can focus on sectors of interest, diplomatic concerns as well, but more specifically on the economic side, right? And pairing up with their counterparts and holding discussions, negotiations, and the like. Again, the effort on the part of Indonesian diplomats to celebrate and remind that African leaders and African leaders respond to this idea of Afro-Asian or Asian-African solidarity is a strong one. So we have a commemorative Asia-Africa conference in 2015, which brings home the significance of this over a period of time. Running in parallel from 2017 onward, with a whole set of preferential trade agreements that began to be open. So we saw everywhere from Mozambique, Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, Egypt, SADC, the Southern African Development Community, East Asia African Development Community, ECOWAS, West Africa, the Gambia. So all of these different active actively articulated preferential trade agreements start to take place, and we see the framework for an expansion. They provide the economic policy framework for expansion of trading relations between the two countries. I mean, behind this is the idea that Indonesia has products which matter to in African markets. Okay, so some of them are the higher value products. We saw automobile parts, products and the like, palm oil exports, food and beverage, which has always been an early starter, even in the 1990s across Southern Africa. Food and beverage moved in to local markets, very well received. We see even, but beyond those more traditional sort of products, we see digital startups, which have been booming in Indonesia, an effort to link up with their counterparts, Sahara, out of Kenya, and other counterparts in the region. Forging of direct air links, right? It's also important in this regard. On the African side, there are the logic of oil, of energy resources matters still. Okay, so the exports that go in that fit into that basket. Minerals, again, both of these are areas where Indonesia has technical expertise and has financial resources and has a long history of involvement. So this is something that African governments recognize as being important. The other thing which I did say earlier is that the trends within Africa, as infrastructure is being built, right, as be it at the coastal side where you've got port infrastructure in place, you're getting the improvements into the interior of road and telecommunications. The general upgrade on infrastructure means that markets, consumers, which had been crucial domestically in Indonesia's own surge in the last decade or two, those kinds of conditions are now available or present in the African context. And so Indonesian business people recognize that opportunity, and it becomes another rationale for positioning themselves in a growing African economy. Yeah, so then we have, in terms of multilateral support, we see Indonesia playing a supportive role at the G20 for the African agenda, and African issues, Agenda 2063, a continental-wide development plan, which quite detailed development plan. So Indonesia has made an explicit effort to promote African interests in that setting, and in that regard, because South Africa also plays a role as a member of the G20, that we have an opportunity for closer ties there. There's an amplifying, I would argue, of ties through interaction that takes place at this setting that might not otherwise happen. IORA is also another place, right? And we saw the shifting of the chairmanship between Indonesia and South Africa. That was a point of that handover also developed an opportunity for continuity and sharing and the like. Indonesia as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, overlapping with South Africa. So what we see in all of these cases in the multilateral setting is a strong imprint of the South Africa-China component, but also I think more generally other African states along the East Coast littoral and the Indian Ocean Rim, and an effort to position Indonesia as a like-minded, supportive actor within African development aspirations. Just to give a further note on the case of South Africa, Indonesia, South Africa Plan of Action was outlined 2017 to 21, which is quite ambitious. I'll make a reference to some of the details again in a moment. But problems in South Africa, those of you who are familiar with the area, has resulted in a weakening of its role and its capacity as a regional labor. It's very interior focused, very domestic focused as they sort out some deep problems within the politics, within the leading party, and the spillover effect in the economy. But the bright spots in this period could be found in the African Union and Kenya and others, including South Africa, that look beyond just terrestrial concerns on the continent. There's the rise of the idea of the blue economy. Again, port infrastructure, railway infrastructure, road infrastructure, all these investments that were characteristics of 2000 onward are enabling these economies to look more critically at the economic resources available to them and in the marine area. Okay, so if that takes us to the through the contemporary, I think we also should reflect upon Indonesian about the pandemic and post-pandemic period. Actually, I'm not going to say very much about the pandemic. I think the story is on the Indonesian side, you know well. On the African side, it's been one of neglect in the first instance. And after neglect, we see China, Russia, and very, very slowly, the European and the United States or the Western countries providing some resources. But gradually there's been a rollout. African governments will point out that it's been an uneven rollout. But one thing that Africa has is certainly post-Ebola in 2014 is a good and the HIV crisis of the earlier era, a pretty good delivery set of delivery systems across many of the countries, and that has enhanced their ability to take in, absorb. They don't have to build new infrastructure as much as one would expect, and absorb the vaccines into the system, but more need to be taken, much more needs to be brought in. Okay, so we'll talk about, but let's talk about not that side of the issue, but rather what it has done. It's the pandemic has reinforced emerging structural trends in the global system, and at the same time it's disrupting some of these trends. Global trade, supply chain, reliance, and the disruption of that reliance has been underscored. That's a very big theme across the global trading system at this stage, you know, as we've experienced shortages or shortfalls, bottlenecks that weren't necessarily there, you know it well, and of course in the microchip area. But at the same time, I think we see the continuation of broad trends around the expansion of South-South trade, South-South investment, the diversification of trade partners, the diversification of sources of financial investment or financial development finance into regions and across regions. And as I argue, I think that you can look at the emerging post-COVID world as an opportunity for new initiatives. One of the things that's happened in that period, it was of course a trend that predates COVID, but we see it more systematically characterized, is reframing the Indian Ocean in geostrategic terms, as geostrategic logic. And this is led principally by Western governments, India, the actions of China, and this sort of idea of that region as holding a security logic, and places it as a site for great power emerging power competition. I've already mentioned the countries involved, and some of the issues we see in the South China Sea, sea lanes, piracy, naval exercises, transshipment, transnational crime. These all play out in the Indian Ocean as well. We see the establishments of naval bases, of the reinforcing of bases that Diego Garcia, of course, you're all familiar with, Djibouti naval base.
I'm sorry, Pat, you have you have 1 to 2 minutes to conclude.
Okay. I'm almost there. I'm almost done. And then dual usage facilities. So if that geopolitical logic is there, it's geoeconomic logic. The blue economy, important for African economies. Fisheries and illegal fishing. No coastal patrols is a reality. Deep water oil and natural gas off of Eastern Africa, mining. Port logistics and infrastructure, which are in place or being put in place, which reship trade. So where can we focus in this case? Security and development, I would argue it can be constructing a partnership for progress, one that builds on all the trends we've seen. And we see that picking up security in the sense of partnering with African states to help protect coastal resources using Indonesian expertise, vessels, and training. Again, we have memorandum of our understanding and some initiatives already in place, but more of that. Development, more preferential trade agreements, more investment agreements, linking this directly with, again, building on the pre-existing trend of the African continental free trade area, which is coming into force this year. And then multilateral cooperation, be it the UN, the G20, IORA, that this forms a crucial part of this story. So why don't I leave it there and turn it back to the chair and thank you for tolerating my spillover into outside of this of the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alden. I think it's very valuable for us that, especially because you remind us the importance of our relationship with Africa. We've had such a good relationship in the past and potentials in the future. I was actually, personally, I was curious because African countries, they've had experience with pandemics before this COVID-19, like the HIV/AIDS and Ebola. I was wondering how Indonesia can also learn something from that, and that perhaps it also can have any contribution to building more solidarity. I don't know. So, but anyway, I leave it to the audience to give comments or questions for our speakers. I know that some questions in the chat. The first one was written with personal message from Muhammad Bimo Anugrah Idris, a student from Political Science Department at UPNVJ Jakarta. So the question was directed to Ed. Is it normal to use mass surveillance apps like Peduli Lindungi to handle pandemic? Because the application increased the potential for authoritarianism, digital authoritarianism during the handling of the pandemic COVID-19. So this is for Pak Ed. And then also a question for Ed from Pak Hairil Akbar. Question to Professor Aspinall. During the pandemic here, some economic policy are very beneficial for corporate groups, like tax incentives. Most economic counter policy is on supply side economic and tend to ignore demand side. Poor people only get that little chunk from bantuan sosial, 300 sampai 400 ribu rupiah per month. When people scramble for oxygen supply and medication, there is hardly any protest or critics to the Jokowi's regime. It's like people just help themselves on their own. Media or other social and political groups keep suggesting people to be patient. It's like the individualization of problem. Do you think this pandemic strengthened the economic oligarchy in Indonesia? This is a very serious question. And also, Pak Khairil addressed a question to Pak Chris. Question for Professor Alden. During pandemic, there is trend of weakened multilateralism. States are going back to their original nature, selfish national interest. Do you think the trend also apply on Indonesia or African foreign policy? And also another question for Pak Chris from Musa Maliki. The first one, do relations Indonesia and Africa can create optimistic global South discourse? I hesitate because their economic growth are still depending on big corporations and technology from the West that is harming the environment as well. The big gap between the rich and the poor under the atmosphere of capitalism system. And secondly, what do you think about China? Is China a responsible stakeholder in global South arena and going to rise peacefully? And then there's another one. I think this one, yeah, this one is to Professor Alden. What is from Samuel Jose? What is the way forward to respond to the Chinese race to African states? Will there be any projected spillover for Indo-Pacific interests, or would US engage also as active as what they did in East Asia? Okay, so we have quite a lot of questions here. Perhaps Ed, Pak Ed, would you like to respond first?
Sure. Thanks for both of those questions. So the first one was about, or the second one, I'll start with the second one, which was about, does the pandemic represent a sort of a shift towards more sort of oligarchic pro-business policies? And I think we can see that that is definitely the case. You know, so the debate here is sort of about, you know, to what extent do we see Indonesian politics being characterized by a form of elite capture, both in a sort of a narrow sense and a broad sense. I guess the broad sense is, you know, to what extent do business interests predominate over those of, say, lower class or ordinary citizens? The more narrower sense, which often gets expressed in the oligarchy literature on Indonesia, is to what degree do we see a sort of a fusion of economic and political power, with wealthy actors themselves increasingly becoming directly engaged in political life as politicians, or through these sort of direct relationships of sponsorship with politicians. So I think we can see evidence certainly for the first form, so a sort of a more generalized shift or tilt towards you know, growing attention to the interests of business. And one obvious example of that is the shift in labor regulations that took place as part of the Omnibus Law, that in the early or earlier in Indonesia's post-reformasi transition, obviously it was considered politically impossible, or at least President SBY decided it was politically impossible to make those sorts of revisions to the labor law that President Jokowi has done last year, right? So there's been a definite sort of shift in the balance of political power in favor of business, and that occurred in the conditions of the pandemic, when it was practically impossible for or practically difficult, I should say, for labor unions and others to mobilize against it. I guess the big question there is whether this is sort of a decisive shift in terms of sort of distribution and you know, the development of a sort of a rudimentary Indonesian welfare state. We still see the development of things like you know, the JKN and so on as providing some sorts of benefits to poorer Indonesians, but it does seem to me that there has been a distinctive shift. So I was certainly a participant in some of these debates about the Indonesian oligarchy, and I tended to fall in the camp that it was not as simple as some of the proponents of oligarchy theory suggested, and there was a great deal of contention still in Indonesian politics, and Indonesian politics is not simply about the expression of oligarchic interests, but I think the balance has shifted. On the narrower debate about the question of oligarchy, I think we could even see a shift taking place in favor of oligarchy in this respect, insofar as the pandemic period has seen basically the crippling of the KPK and the crippling of Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission, which was at least one reasonably effective check on the on the, let's say, corrupt relations between business and politics in Indonesia. Basically the only significant institutional check on that relationship. So that now has been effectively neutralized. So yes, I think the answer to the question, and I'm sorry I can't remember who asked it, is sort of a yes on both the narrow and the broad meaning of the oligarchy debate. The first question was about apps that monitor movement and so on during pandemic. So this isn't something I've followed so much. I mean, these have been widely used in many different countries. Without having done any research or thought about this in a great deal of detail, I would just assume that the extent to which these are used for political monitoring would be entirely dependent upon the political context and the regime type in which those apps are applied. So using, I mean, for example, in my own country, Australia, those sorts of check-in apps and so on are very, very wide. In fact, they're compulsory, but there's no real significant concern about these being used for political purposes. But in China, completely different. Well, I mean, I suppose they don't need it in China, but because they have such sophisticated methods for doing this anyway. But the point is that it really is dependent on the character of the political regime. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Pak Chris, would you like to respond to the questions?
Sure. Just to make a comment following on your own one about health diplomacy, and I think there really is a great deal of an opportunity here to look at the experiences of Africa, which has been consequential in terms of fighting pandemics, in terms of policies and rolling out at local level public health at the most local level. Sometimes the failings at the national level were not replicated at the local level, and partnering with foreign outside and including WHO actors to deliver medicines in a timely way, getting doctors on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're right. I think that's somewhere to explore. Coming to the questions that others had put forward, I agree that multilateralism is weakening, but Indonesia and African states are natural multilateralists. That while they may inhabit a context where multilateralism is weakening, at least it's certainly as reflected in responses to health policy, the comparative and competitive divides between the United States and China playing out as well. But multilateralism was hothoused in the most dire of circumstances, far more dire than our own, right? And I think the cooperation of Indonesia and Africa is just one example of that from 1955. That form of multilateralism was in a sense created in response to the securitization of the globe through bipolar conflict. So I think that we really just need to recognize that maybe a more robust multilateralism, commitment to multilateralism has to be pursued. The other comment I would make is that maybe it's faltering at the global level, but at regional level, there's plenty of opportunity to sustain and frame that, be it ASEAN, be it the African Union, be it subunits within that. The other question talked about an optimistic, whether we see an optimistic Global South discourse, and pointed out the problems that even if there is this optimistic discourse, that there's reliance on Western technologies which have been environmentally compromise the environment in sometimes quite severe ways, and that rising inequality is also featured in this engagement. I mean, I think I would distinguish between those things which are policy driven and those which are technology and what have you. Okay, the technologies of extraction, mineral extraction, or resource extraction can be very, very complicated and polluting, and we really haven't come up with better or if we have come up with better ways to do it, those have been deemed too costly, or what have you. The policy side of this is definitely something we can exercise influence over. So we can decide that rising incomes can be rising divisions between incomes, rising inequality between states and or within states can be offset by sensible policies which allocate resources in different ways towards social areas or things like that. So I think that we in tackling this optimism, I think this question of whether to be optimistic or not about the global South, when looking at Indonesia, Africa, we can say, you know, let's look at the policies behind it, framework that can offset some of the worst undesirable outcomes. This also brings us to the last part of that person's question, and of course the last question, which is really about China and China's role in Africa and different concerns there. One of them being, is it that term, is it a responsible stakeholder? I would say that certainly Beijing made strenuous efforts to demonstrate it is a responsible stakeholder, investing in multilateral institutions and in particular peacekeeping, amongst other things. So I think we see that. And yet at the same time, certainly under Xi Jinping, there's an effort to say, look, we also have our interests, and our interests are clear, and they, you know, those are paramount in guiding us. So I think that this reflects the China position within global affairs. My last comment is directed towards the last question, which is, I think there's an opportunity here to offset some of the worst features of growing competition between West and China, that the Indian Ocean Rim, amongst others, a fairly, it's still a amorphous organization with some directives and what have you, could provide a stronger setting if for discussion of what kind of region do we see here, and when we see international actors stepping in, are they doing so in a way that furthers our commercial, our environmental, our regional interests in this particular area? So I think that you know, holding outside actors, be they China, be they US, be they any of them, to account for their behavior in the region is crucial to assert, so that it doesn't degenerate into the kind of confrontational situation we see in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Chris and Pak Ed. There are still some more questions addressed in personal message to me, but unfortunately we're running out of time. I really appreciate your comments and discussions today for all the speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And also for audience, if you still have pending questions or thoughts, you are most welcome to write to the organizers, and then the organizer will pass it to each of the speakers. So again, thank you so much. I've learned a lot for this evening, and I'm pretty sure also, like Ed, for example, it's pretty late now there in Canberra, but also Pak Chris and also Pak Valerie and Professor Shahibi, your time is highly appreciated for us to share here in the discussion. I'm giving back the chair or the room to our lovely Elizabeth, Ibet here, the MC. Ibet, terima kasih. Saya kembalikan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Bayu, and for all speakers. Thank you for the engaging discussion. And now, before we will close the conference, we would like to inform you several information. The first one, we will send the participant certificate to your email. Kindly please check your email in your inbox or spam regularly. Second, we would like to invite all of the participants to take a group photo. Kindly please to open your camera. However, due to time constraint, we understand that not all of the participants could be take part in this group photo session. So we are sorry for limiting our group photo in just 3 rounds. Okay. Okay, the first one in 3, 2, 1. Okay, the second one in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and for the last in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay. Now we will close the conference. On behalf of the committee, I would like to extend our gratitude to all of you in making this event success. Let us all be guided by all the things we have learned and heard throughout the conference. Thank you. Till we meet again, perhaps in the next conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Sekali lagi kami mengumumkan tidak perlu untuk mengisi absen JICOSSH buat para presenter Semnas. Yeah. For those of you who already present your paper in Semnas, you don't have to fill the JICOSSH link. Yeah. So you just have to only fill the links that I shared before, the bit.ly/absent Semnas 2021. Thank you. And participants, you may leave the meeting. Again, on behalf of the committee of the Semnas, we would like to apologize for the drama this afternoon. Thank you very much. Asma, you may leave the meeting, yeah? For the participants, thank you.